I'm not doing this for attention. I want to say that first, because I know how these things sound when you hear them from someone else. I know how easy it is to assume someone is exaggerating, or processing something badly, or just looking for a reaction. I spent 3 years as an EMT before I took the SAR position. I've seen what happens when people sensationalize trauma. I've watched it make the trauma smaller somehow by dressing it up in language it doesn't deserve. So I'm not doing that. What I'm doing is telling you what happened at Harlan Ridge, because 11 months of not telling anyone has done something to me that I don't entirely know how to describe. It sits in my chest in a specific way. Not pain, exactly. More like pressure. The kind that reminds you it's there every time you breathe in too deep. I left search and rescue in October. I work a data entry job now, remote, from a 1-bedroom apartment in a city where the tallest trees are the ones planted in sidewalk squares. I run in the mornings. I cook actual meals. I sleep a reasonable number of hours most nights. By every measurable standard, my life looks completely fine. But I don't own a flashlight. Not a single one. I had 4 when I left 2 tactical, 1 headlamp, 1 pocket-sized backup. I left them all in the truck before I turned in my gear and drove away. I haven't bought one since. My phone screen is the only light I use after dark, and I keep the brightness low. If you're wondering why, that's what this story is about. I should start where it actually started, which wasn't in the forest. It was in a parking lot in Harlan County, Kentucky, on a morning that felt completely unremarkable. The drive to Harlan Ridge takes 47 minutes from the county seat, and for the last 20 of those minutes, there is no cell signal, no radio station that comes in clearly, and no other vehicles on the road. Just a 2-lane blacktop that narrows into a gravel fire road, and on either side of that road, trees so close together that the canopy closes over you, like a hand closing into a fist. I remember the exact moment the pavement ended. The truck tires moved from smooth asphalt to loose gravel, and the sound changed, that dry crunch, irregular and sharp, and I watched the tree line swallow the road ahead of me, and felt something I still can't name correctly. It wasn't fear. I wasn't afraid of forests. I'd grown up near one. I'd done trail work summers in college. The wilderness had never felt hostile to me before that morning. It wasn't excitement either, though I told myself at the time that was what it was. It was something closer to recognition. Not the recognition of a place you visited before. Something older than that. The feeling of a place that has already registered your existence before you've introduced yourself. Like stepping into a room where everyone already knows your name and has been waiting, politely, for you to arrive. I drove the rest of the fire road slowly, telling myself it was because of the gravel surface. The ridgeline appeared through the trees as I came around the last bend, gray limestone over dark green. The morning sky behind it, pale and flat. It was objectively beautiful, the kind of landscape that belongs on a state park brochure. I parked in the clearing outside the station gate and sat in the truck for a moment longer than I needed to. The forest was quiet, in the way that dense forests are quiet. Not silent, but layered. Wind in the upper canopy. Something moving in the brush to the east. The low, continuous sound of the ridge itself, which I can only describe as a kind of pressure against the ears, like the mountain was exhaling slowly. I got out of the truck. The air smelled like wet piney and cold stone. The station coordinator was already at the gate with his hand out and a manila envelope under his arm. And he introduced himself the way people in remote postings always introduce themselves efficiently, without preamble, as though small talk is a resource you don't waste this far from town. What he didn't mention, as he walked me through the gate and toward the station door, was that the most important document I would read during my time at Harlan Ridge was already sitting on the desk inside, waiting. Warren Hale was 58 years old, built like someone who had spent 30 years doing physical work outdoors, and then spent 5 years behind a desk, and never quite reconciled the two. Broad through the shoulders, a little thick in the middle, with hands that looked like they'd gripped a lot of rope and radio equipment over the years. His face was the kind of face that gave nothing away, not unfriendly, but economical. He smiled once when he shook my hand, and not again for the rest of that first morning. He'd come up through wildland firefighting before transitioning to SAR coordination in the late 90s. He knew the Harlan Ridge district the way some people know the layout of their own house, in the dark, without thinking, without uncertainty, by a knowledge that had become instinct. I noticed it in the way he moved through the station, never checking signs, never hesitating at a turn, walking the exact center of every corridor without touching the walls. The briefing itself was standard. He walked me through the radio channels, primary, secondary, emergency, and the grid designation system that divided the district into numbered sectors. He covered shift rotations, the vehicle checkout process, the protocol for calling in a missing person report versus initiating an active search, the escalation ladder for requesting mutual aid from adjacent districts. He talked about the terrain with the specific, unsentimental vocabulary of someone who respected it but had no illusions about it. Ridge topology, drainage patterns, the sectors with reliable radio coverage, and the sectors without. He mentioned, without emphasis, that there were areas of the northern district where VHF signals degraded unpredictably due to mineral interference in the underlying rock. I was writing notes. I was absorbing it the way I absorbed shift briefings in the emergency department, methodically, flagging the things I'd need to recall under pressure. And then, without breaking the rhythm of the briefing, Hale mentioned Sector 9. He mentioned it the way you mention a road closure, factually, briefly. It was a northern sector, bounded by the upper ridge on one side and a federally designated wilderness buffer on the other. He noted the radio blackout zones within it. He noted the topographic difficulty. He noted that it had an elevated historical rate of missing person incidents relative to its traffic volume. And then he moved on. But his voice had changed when he said it. It was a small change, the kind that most people would not have caught. A half beat of additional control. The same tone, the same pace, but with something carefully placed behind it. The way a careful person sounds when they are deciding, in real time, how much to say. I noted it. I didn't comment on it. I kept writing. The Ridge Station was a single-story building, concrete block construction, painted a green that had faded over the decades to something closer to gray. Inside, a radio room, a small operations center with topo maps tacked to the plywood walls, a narrow kitchen, 2 bunk rooms, a storage area in the back, and a locked metal cabinet that Hale gestured toward briefly and described as containing legacy equipment from previous district configurations. He said I wouldn't need anything in the cabinet. He didn't offer to show me what was inside. The topo maps were the most interesting thing in the room, initially. They covered the full district in overlapping sheets, each one pencil-marked with grid sector boundaries, search corridor annotations, waypoints labeled in a cramped, efficient hand. Some of the marks were recent, clean pencil lines, sharp edges. Some were old enough that the paper had darkened around them. I spent some time looking at the northern sections. Sector 9 was marked in the same pencil as everything else. Nothing about its notation was unusual, but someone had pressed harder when drawing its boundary lines. The indentation in the paper went deeper than the surrounding marks. The bunk room I was assigned was the one on the east side of the building. Standard equipment cot, wool blanket, small shelf, a hook on the wall for gear. The mattress was new. The pillow was not. I was setting my pack down when I saw the strip of masking tape above the bunk frame. It was the kind of masking tape that had been there long enough to yellow at the edges. Written on it in black marker, the permanent kind. Pressed firm enough that the letters had slightly bled into the tape, were 4 words. Trust the 8 minutes. That was all. I stood there and read it twice. The previous volunteer's personal items were gone from the room. The shelf was empty. The hook on the wall held nothing. Whoever had slept in this bunk before me had taken everything with them, everything except that strip of tape, which was either a deliberate thing to leave behind or something they had simply forgotten. I didn't know which possibility was more unsettling. I told myself it was probably an inside joke, a reference to something procedural, something that would make sense once I'd been on a few shifts. I told myself that, and mostly believed it, and went back out to the operations room where Hale was finishing the last of the paperwork. That night, I read through the standard SAR documentation, ate, checked in on the radio, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. I fell asleep quickly and completely, which is something I was good at back then, the ability to sleep anywhere, on demand, as a survival skill developed during years of irregular shift work. I know now that that first night of easy sleep is the thing that looks strangest in retrospect. Hale left at 6 in the evening, after the first radio check of my shift. He told me the schedule, reminded me of the check-in times, and drove his truck back down the fire road without ceremony. I watched the taillights disappear around the first bend, and then stood in the clearing for a moment before going back inside. The quality of the silence that settled after the truck sound faded was something I was not prepared for. I have been in quiet places before. I have worked night shifts in hospital corridors at 3 in the morning, which have their own cellular silence, fluorescent and humming, and vaguely anxious. I have sat in empty parking structures and empty churches, and the kind of rural roads where you can go 10 minutes without seeing headlights. I know what quiet feels like. This was not that kind of quiet. This was a silence with pressure in it. The forest was still producing sound, the canopy moving in the upper wind, something crossing the brush to the east, the occasional distant sound that was probably a bird, but carried no clear direction. But underneath all of that, there was a quality to the air itself that made you aware of your own breathing, aware of the fact that breathing was a sound, aware, in some peripheral and irrational way, that you were the loudest thing for a very long distance. I went inside. I locked the door out of habit, not logic. There was no one within 47 minutes of me in any direction, and I sat at the operations desk and went through the rest of the documentation Hale had left. The laminated card was on the corner of the desk. I'd noticed it during the briefing, but hadn't read it yet. I picked it up, read the first 2 lines, set it, face down. Something about reading it in that specific silence felt like a commitment I wasn't ready to make. I told myself I'd read it properly in the morning, in daylight, with coffee. I went to bed. Above my head, the masking tape caught the weak light from the hallway. Trust the 8 minutes. I closed my eyes. I slept. Outside, the forest did whatever forests do in the dark on Appalachian ridges when no one is watching. The next morning, I read the laminated card properly. By the time I finished, I had 2 reactions. The first was confusion. The second was that I picked up my pen and wrote the words "check regulations" in my field notebook, because some of what was on that card couldn't possibly be real. The card was standard laminate, the kind you'd find in any institutional setting, the thick, glossy kind that survives spills and field conditions. The font was plain, the formatting clean. It looked exactly like an official supplementary protocol document, which I would come to understand was precisely the point. Whatever it was, it had been designed to look like the most boring piece of paper in the room. I read it slowly, the way I read drug interaction charts in the ER, looking for the logic underneath the language, trying to understand not just what it said, but why each specific word had been chosen. There were 7 rules. The first one said, if a subject is recovered within Sector 9 after nightfall, the subject must be held at the Ridge Station overnight. Do not transport until first light, regardless of medical stability or subject request. I read that twice. Regardless of medical stability. That phrase sat wrong in my chest. As an EMT, delayed transport is a decision with consequences real, documented, sometimes fatal consequences. There are circumstances where it's clinically indicated. There are also circumstances where a rule like this would be institutional negligence. I wrote, Rule 1, transport restriction. Why? Geographic? Liability? The second rule said, do not make verbal confirmation of a subject's identity in the field. Use only signal codes. A subject who asks you to confirm their name aloud should be guided, not answered. I stopped on that one for a long moment. In every SAR training I had received, name-based contact was encouraged. Calling out to a lost person by name established rapport, confirmed orientation, and guided them toward your position. This rule inverted that completely. I wrote, Rule 2, no verbal name confirmation. Superstition? Legal? The third rule said, if a subject is found outside a designated search corridor and claims they were never lost, complete the SAR DOC form but do not enter their name into the district incident log. File only a sector clearance report. The fourth said, any subject who references specific personal information about a team member, their home address, a family member's name, or a recent conversation should be escorted to the edge of the search corridor and released back toward the tree line. Do not restrain. Do not follow. The fifth, if radio contact is lost for more than 12 minutes during a night search in sectors 7 through 11, team members must return to the last marked waypoint and remain stationary for no fewer than 8 minutes before resuming. Do not call out during the stationary period. 8 minutes. There it was. Trust the 8 minutes. Not an inside joke, an instruction. The sixth rule addressed photographs. Photographs taken within active search corridors must be reviewed at base camp before being shared. Any photograph containing an unlogged subject must be deleted without discussion and reported only to the district coordinator. And the seventh, which I read 3 times. Any subject who exhibits the following: body temperature below 94 degrees Fahrenheit without environmental explanation, pupils that do not respond to flashlight, or breath that does not produce vapor in sub 50 degrees Fahrenheit conditions should not be touched. Guide them to camp. Notify the district coordinator only. I set the card down on the desk and looked at it from a slight distance, the way you look at something when you want to check whether it looks different from farther away. It didn't. It still looked official, specific, operational, written by someone who had reason to write each clause exactly as they had written it. And that was the part I couldn't dismiss as easily as I wanted to. I radioed Hale at the top of the 8 o'clock check-in window. We covered the standard items: weather, grid status, no active calls, and then I told him I'd read the supplementary field guidance document. There was a half-second pause before he responded, short enough that you could attribute it to radio lag. Good, he said. Treat them as standard protocol. I asked him how long the rules had been in place. He said since the early 80s, though some of them had precursors going back further. I asked who had written them. He said they had been formalized by the district office following a series of operational reviews. He said it in the specific way that institutional people describe institutional things smoothly, without detail. I pushed a little. I told him that Rule 3, specifically the sector clearance report provision, the part about not logging a subject's name, seemed to conflict with standard SARDOC requirements. A found subject is a found subject. Their information goes in the incident log. That's not optional. That's federal documentation protocol. Hale was quiet for longer this time, long enough that I checked the radio to make sure the transmission was still active. Then he said, "That rule hasn't failed anyone yet." I wrote the sentence down verbatim in my field notebook, not because I knew what it meant yet, because the way he said it made me understand, instinctively, that it was the most precise thing he was willing to say. It implied, with great care, that other rules had. I didn't ask him which ones. Not yet. Instead, I thanked him, signed off on the check-in, and sat at the desk with my notebook open and the laminated card beside it. I thought about Rule 1 and what delayed transport means clinically. I thought about Rule 2 and what it means to find a lost person and not be permitted to call their name. I thought about Rule 4, releasing a subject back toward the tree line, not restraining them, not following, and tried to construct a scenario in which that protocol made any kind of institutional sense. I couldn't. Not yet. For the next 6 days, Harlan Ridge was unremarkable. I mean that in the most literal sense. The work was the work. Grid assessments, radio checks, equipment inventory, a trail conditions report for the southern sectors. On day 3, a pair of trail runners came in over the northern access route 2 hours past their registered exit time. I made contact, confirmed they were uninjured, filed the paperwork. Routine. On day 5, a family group had camped 2 sectors east of their permitted zone. No emergency, no injury, just a compass error and a miscalculated topo reading. I walked them back to their site, documented it, and filed a permit violation report that would go nowhere. On day 6, I found a day pack on a trail junction in Sector 6. Blue, mid-size, institutional brand. It contained a rain jacket, an empty water bottle, a granola bar wrapper, and a small notebook with nothing written inside. I logged it, photographed it, submitted a found property report. No one ever came to claim it. I noted that detail and then moved on. The way you move on from anomalies that don't demand immediate attention. The forest was quiet. The work was procedural. The ridge felt, if not welcoming, at least neutral. And in that neutrality, I stopped thinking about the laminated card. Not completely, not consciously, but the way you stop thinking about a thing when days pass and the thing it describes doesn't materialize. The rules began to feel like what I'd initially suspected, overcautious institutional language, the product of some administrative mind that had decided to over-document edge cases that rarely or never occurred. I went to bed on the 6th night, feeling settled, competent, like I understood the job and the place, and like the job and the place understood me. That feeling lasted until day 8. The morning the call came in about Marcus Webb. The missing person call came in through the county dispatch relay at 6:22 in the morning. Marcus Webb, 34 years old. Experienced hiker, according to his girlfriend's report. He'd gone out on a solo overnight into the northern sector's registered permit, documented route, planned exit at the southern trailhead by 5 p.m. the previous evening. She'd waited until midnight before calling it in, then waited until morning to call again. He was 18 hours overdue when the relay reached me. I pulled the SARDOC form and started building the profile. The ISRID behavioral tables, the statistical models that describe how different missing person demographics behave in wilderness environments, put an experienced adult hiker in the moderate risk category. They tend to self-rescue if mobile. They tend to stay near trails. They tend to make noise. His point last seen, or PLS, was documented by a trailhead parking lot camera. The county had pulled the footage within an hour of the report. The image came through on the district printer thermal, slightly washed out, but clear enough. Marcus Webb at 6:14 a.m., 2 days prior, adjusting the hip straps on a gray external frame pack, looking at something off to the left of the frame. Completely ordinary. I looked at that photograph for a while. He looked like someone who knew what he was doing. Good gear, right fit, morning departure. Nothing in the image suggested anything other than a prepared hiker starting a prepared trip. I assigned him a statistical likelihood corridor on the topo map, covering the sectors his permitted route crossed. The corridor reached, on its northern edge, the boundary of Sector 7. I noted that and drew the line where the documentation told me to draw it. I did not draw it into Sector 9. Not yet. That wasn't where the math pointed. I called Hale. He told me he'd coordinate a hasty team from the county volunteer pool and have them at the trailhead by 9. I told him I'd take point on the field assessment, and he said, simply, copy. The morning was gray and cold. The kind of cold that eastern Kentucky does in early October. Not dramatic, just relentless. The kind of cold that finds the gap between your collar and your neck and stays there. I drove to the trailhead. I parked beside the space that still held Marcus Webb's car, a dark green Subaru, windows fogged from the inside with 2 days of temperature change. I stood next to it for a moment and looked at the trail opening in the tree line. The forest at the start of that trail was just a forest. I didn't know that yet, how much it wasn't. The hasty team was 2 people, myself and a volunteer named Garrett, a county deputy who had done enough SAR work to move quickly through terrain without needing to be managed. We paired well. He didn't talk unnecessarily. I didn't explain things he already knew. We worked the probability corridor east of the PLS, moving north in a modified, hasty pattern. Not a full grid, just the high probability zones. Trails, saddles, water sources, anywhere a hiker might pause or rest or become disoriented. The forest was dense, but navigable in daylight. The canopies was starting to thin at the edges, where the season was pulling color out of the leaves, and the light came through in long, angled pieces, copper and gray. Objectively, it was the kind of autumn forest that people photograph. We found the first sign at the 2-hour mark. A broken tent stake at the edge of a campsite cut 20 meters off the main trail. The site wasn't his registered location, but it was within reasonable error margin. Someone had been here recently. The fire ring held ash that was still slightly tacky with moisture. Garrett photographed it, and I measured the ash temperature with a field thermometer out of habit. Still slightly above ambient. Recent within 24 hours. Consistent with Marcus's timeline. We pressed north. At the 3-hour mark, we found a candy bar wrapper caught in low brush, the specific brand. I noted without knowing yet why it mattered. That matched the one in Marcus's registered supply list, submitted with his overnight permit. And then the boot prints. Clear impressions in a soft, muddy section of trail where a seasonal drainage crossed the path. The right size, the right tread up. I photographed them, noted the depth and stride length. They led north. We followed them for another 40 minutes, through a section of trail that progressively narrowed, the canopy closing down, the brush thickening on either side. And then they stopped. Not at a rock shelf, not at a water crossing, not at any transition in the terrain that would explain a change in surface medium. The prints simply ended in the middle of a soft, muddy section of trail that should have captured impressions perfectly. The last print was a left foot, fully pressed, heel and toe both clear. There was no right foot after it. Garrett and I stood there and looked at the ground without speaking for about 15 seconds. Wind wouldn't do that. he said finally. No, I said. I photographed the end point. I photographed the surrounding ground. I photographed the brush on both sides of the trail, where someone stepping off the path would have left compression marks in the undergrowth. There were no compression marks. That evening at base camp, I sat with my camera and reviewed the field photographs. I worked through them systematically, the way I had been trained, checking for detail, confirming documentation quality. And then I reached the 5th photograph, the one I'd taken at the edge of the trail rail before we found the prints. There was someone in it, standing at the tree line, roughly 30 meters behind where Garrett and I had been standing, half concealed by brush, upright, wearing what looked like hiking clothes. I had not seen this person during the search. Garrett had not mentioned anyone. The sector had been cleared by the perimeter team as unoccupied before we entered. I zoomed in until the image degraded. The figure was looking at the camera. I picked up the laminated card from the desk and found Rule 6. Read it once. Read it again. I deleted the photograph. I picked up the radio. I sat with the deletion for a moment after it was done. That's not quite accurate. The deletion itself takes a second, a button press, a confirmation, and then the image is simply gone. What I sat with was the space where the image had been. The specific weight of having looked at something and then chosen to unmake it according to a rule I still didn't entirely understand. I'm an EMT. My training is built on documentation. You document everything. You document it in real time. You document it again in the report. And the documentation is the thing that protects you, and the thing that protects the patient. The idea of deliberately destroying field evidence, even field evidence that had no immediate clinical significance, went against something fundamental in how I had been trained to work. But the rule had been specific. Photographs containing an unlogged subject, a person not on the team manifest, must be deleted without discussion and reported only to the district coordinator. The figure in the photograph was not on my team manifest. I reported it to Hale on the radio. I described it factually. Grid reference, approximate position, relative to my location, approximate time of capture. I did not describe what the figure had been doing. I said there was a person in the photograph who had not been visible to the team during the search. Hale asked one question. Which sector number? I told him. The silence on the radio lasted long enough that I double-checked the transmission indicator. Then Hale said, "Copy. I'll be at the station at 0600 tomorrow." His voice had done the thing again. The thing it had done when he mentioned Sector 9 during the welcome briefing. The half-beat of additional control. The tone held precisely in place while something behind it shifted. I set the radio down. Outside the station windows, the forest had gone completely dark. The generator hummed in the utility room. The overhead light in the operations center cast everything in flat, institutional white. I thought about the figure standing at the tree line, the way it had been facing the camera, the way it had been standing upright, still, positioned with a kind of deliberateness that I kept trying to attribute to coincidence. I thought about the boot prints that ended in the mud without explanation. And I thought about Marcus Webb's dark green Subaru, still parked at the trailhead, with its windows fogged from the inside, waiting for someone who hadn't come back to it yet. I didn't sleep well that night, which was the first night at Harlan Ridge that I didn't. Hale arrived at 5:58. He drove up the fire road in the dark, and I heard the gravel under his tires a full minute before his headlights hit the station windows. He came inside, poured coffee from the pot I'd made, and stood at the topo map for a long time without speaking. Then he moved the search corridor. He did it physically, took the pencil from the operations desk, and drew new boundary lines on the northern sector map, pulling the active search area south and east, away from the Sector 9 boundary and the Upper Ridge Trail. The new corridor concentrated effort in the lower saddle between Sectors 6 and 7. Gentler terrain, better radio coverage, farther from wherever Marcus Webb's boot prints had ended. He called it topographic difficulty, resource allocation. He mentioned the slope gradient in the northern sections as a factor. Every reason he gave was technically accurate. Every reason he gave was also a reason that had existed before yesterday, before my photograph, before his question about the sector number. Those reasons hadn't changed overnight. His corridor hadn't. I said, the prints led north. The probability density is still higher in the upper corridor. He said, I know. And then he didn't say anything else. He picked up his coffee and looked at the map, and the subject was finished. But he added his own name to the next day's field team manifest. He hadn't gone into the field once during the 6 days I'd been at the station. He was a coordinator, not a field operative by his own designation during the welcome briefing. The physical work was handled by the hasty teams and grid teams from the volunteer pool. He added his name in pencil, in that same cramped, efficient hand that had marked the sector boundaries on the topo maps. Added it without comment, without explanation, and then moved on to the logistics briefing, as though nothing unusual had happened. I watched him and said nothing, because I was still learning the shape of what I didn't know. And one of the first things you learn in emergency work is that the most dangerous mistakes come from speaking with certainty before you have enough information. I had enough information to know that Warren Hale was afraid of something. I did not yet have enough to know what. The second day of the Marcus Webb search, Hale and I covered the eastern section of the reassigned corridor in the morning. The volunteer grid team swept the southern sections. By early afternoon, the probability density in the lower saddle was effectively exhausted. We had covered the viable terrain and found nothing new. No signs, no trail disturbance, nothing consistent with an overdue hiker in that area. The mathematics of search management have a logic to them that is both useful and uncomfortable. When you exhaust the most likely areas, you move to the less likely ones. The statistics push you. And in this case, the statistics pushed north. Hale knew it. He was the one reading the ISRID tables. He was the one who had been doing this for 30 years. We reached the Sector 9 grid boundary at approximately 2:40 in the afternoon. There is a physical marker there, an aluminum post, knee height, with the sector designation stamped into it, positioned at a trail junction where the main path splits north and east. Standard district infrastructure. Nothing unusual about it. We stopped at the post. Hale was a step ahead of me. and he stopped without any visible reason. The way an experienced outdoorsman stops when something in the environment changes below the threshold of conscious identification. And then we heard it. A voice, coming from north of the boundary, inside Sector 9, perhaps 40 meters in, where the trail curved and the canopy closed. A clear voice, adult male, moderate volume, conversational register, saying his own name. Marcus? Marcus? Marcus Webb? Not calling out. Not the panicked calling of a lost person trying to signal their location. Not the weak, disoriented repetition of someone suffering from exposure. It was even exploratory, like someone reading a name off a card and practicing the pronunciation. I took a breath to respond. The instinct is immediate and almost physical. The voice of a lost person. And you call back. You confirm contact. You use their name, and Hale's hand found my forearm. Hard. He held up 2 fingers with his other hand. Rule 2. No verbal name confirmation in the field. I closed my mouth. The voice said it again. Marcus. Marcus Webb. A pause, and then, in a different register, slightly adjusted, slightly more natural, as though it had been listening for feedback and recalibrating without it. Hello? That one word in that adjusted tone was the most frightening thing I had heard to that point in my life, because it sounded like a man trying to sound like a man who was lost. It sounded like something performing lostness, testing the sounds of it against the air, and listening for a response that would tell it whether the performance was working. We backed away from the boundary post slowly. Hale moved first, and I moved with him, matching his pace, neither of us speaking. When we had put 100 meters between ourselves and the boundary, Hale stopped and turned around and looked at me. His face was the same controlled face it always was, but his jaw was set differently. And he hadn't let go of his radio since the moment the voice started. We were back at base camp before Hale spoke in complete sentences again. He sat across the operations desk from me, both hands wrapped around his coffee mug, and he said, "That was the good outcome." I waited. "The good outcome," he said again, "is that we heard it, and we backed away correctly. That's what the good outcome looks like." I asked him what the alternative was. He shook his head. Not a refusal. More like the head shake of someone who has decided that certain information does more harm than good at a particular moment in time. He told me to read the rules again before I slept. He told me that for the remainder of the Marcus Webb search, Rule 1 and Rule 7 needed to be at the front of my mind. I asked him why those 2 specifically. He looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he said, "Because those are the 2 that require you to override everything you've ever been trained to do." Coming from a former EMT, sitting across from a man who had just watched me nearly call out to a voice, saying a lost man's name in an empty forest, that sentence landed with a particular kind of weight. He knew about my EMT background. It was in my application file. He knew exactly which nerve he was pressing when he said it. Rule 1. Don't transport, regardless of medical stability. Rule 7. Don't treat the clinical signs of hypothermia if the 3 specific markers are present. Both of those rules asked me to watch someone who appeared to need help, and choose not to help them. The 2 hardest things in my professional vocabulary. He was telling me those were the ones I needed to be ready to follow. I said I understood. He nodded once and finished his coffee and told me he'd be back at 0600. After he left, I lay on my bunk and looked at the masking tape. Trust the 8 minutes. I understood that one. Now Rule 5. The stationary silence window during radio blackout in Sectors 7 through 11. The previous volunteer had felt strongly enough about it to leave it written above the bed, where they'd see it every morning. I thought about whether that meant the previous volunteer had needed to use Rule 5. And I thought about why that volunteer was no longer here. I was running the grid team's debriefing on day 3 of the search when the county liaison radioed to tell me there was a civilian at the trailhead access gate requesting contact with the search coordinator. I drove out myself. I don't know why exactly I could have sent the liaison. Something in the phrasing, requesting contact, which is not how family members who are falling apart phrase things. This sounded like someone who had controlled themselves into a very precise request. She was standing outside the gate when I pulled up. Not pacing, not on her phone, just standing on the gravel shoulder of the fire road access with her arms crossed loosely over her jacket, watching my truck come down the road. She looked like someone who had driven 4 hours and slept maybe 2 of the past 72, and had made a decision somewhere on the interstate that a composure was the only resource she had left. Her name was Claire. She told me that when we shook hands, and nothing else for a moment. Just her name. And then she looked at me with the specific expression that I recognized from emergency department waiting rooms. The expression that is not hope exactly, because hope requires something to hold on to. And this expression had let go of everything in order to survive the not knowing. She asked me if Marcus was alive. She said it exactly that way, not whether we'd found him, not how the search was going. Whether he was alive, the most precise question, stripped of every buffer. I told her we were still actively searching, that we hadn't found any evidence of serious incident, that the probability profile for his subject category was still favorable. I said it in the voice I had used in emergency department corridors, the one that is honest without being cruel, that gives real information without giving the weight of uncertainty along with it. She listened. She nodded. And then she said, "He called me this morning." I asked her what she meant. She took out her phone. She said she'd gotten a voicemail at 7:43 that morning. She'd been asleep, had missed the call, had woken up to the notification. She said it was his number, his voice, and she'd listened to it 6 times on the drive here. She pressed play. The recording quality was clear. No static, no wind interference, no the muffled quality of a phone operated by cold, exhausted hands. It was clean. And the voice was Marcus Webb's, or it was a voice that matched every recording of him I had subsequently heard in the next 48 hours of this case, with a specificity that went beyond impression. He said he was fine. He said he'd gotten turned around in the upper sector and lost the trail in the dark 2 nights ago, but that he'd found his bearings and was working his way back toward the southern trailhead. He used Claire's name twice a specific, practiced intimacy in the way he said it. He referenced their apartment by a particular detail. He said a phrase that I could tell, from Claire's expression when it played, was something private between them. Something that could only have come from him. He said he'd see her soon. He said it warmly. He said goodbye the way people say goodbye when they are not afraid and not uncertain and fully expect to see the person they're calling within a few hours. The voicemail ended. I stood on the gravel shoulder of the fire road and kept my face in the position I needed it to be in, which was calm and professional and giving nothing away. At 7:40 a.m. that morning, I had been standing at the Sector 9 grid boundary with Hale. 3 minutes before that voicemail was recorded, I had heard a voice in the forest saying, Marcus Webb, in an exploratory tone, practicing. 3 minutes later, that same voice had called Claire's phone. It had known her name. It had known the apartment detail. It had known the private phrase. I thought about Rule 3. I thought about what Rule 3 actually meant when you stood next to a woman playing a voicemail from a man who was not where the voicemail said he was. If we found someone in that forest claiming to be Marcus Webb, claiming he had never been lost, the rule said to file a sector clearance report and erase him from the incident log. It said his name would appear nowhere in the official documentation, which meant Claire would have no record, no follow-up, no institutional confirmation of what had happened to him. The rule existed to prevent something from using official documentation to establish a traceable identity after leaving the forest. I understood that. I did. And I still stood there on the gravel with Claire playing her voicemail a second time, and felt something close to physical illness at the thought of following it. I told Claire that we would continue the search, and that I would contact her the moment there was any development. I said it clearly and directly, and I did not tell her anything else. I did not tell her that the voicemail had almost certainly not been made by the man she was waiting for. I did not tell her about Rule 3, or what it would mean if someone came out of that forest wearing Marcus's voice and his memories and his private vocabulary. I did not tell her that in a worst-case scenario, the official documentation of this search might eventually show only a sector clearance report with no name attached. I drove back to the station. I sat at the operations desk. I opened my field notebook to a blank page. The patient I'd lost in the emergency department was a man named Gerald, 51 years old, cardiac event. I had followed the protocol, the exact, correct, medically defensible protocol, and Gerald had died in a way that I spent a long time afterward wondering would have been different if I had trusted my instinct at the moment it diverged from procedure. I had never resolved that question. I had left the emergency department partly to stop asking it. And here I was again, sitting across from a rule that asked me to override instinct for reasons I understood imperfectly, in service of a protocol that had been written by people who understood something I was still learning. I wrote in my field notebook, if we find him outside the corridor, Rule 3. I hate this rule. Then I put the notebook down. I got up and went to the filing cabinet in the back of the station, the one that Hale had not offered to open on my first day. It was unlocked. I hadn't thought to check before. Inside, behind a row of current year Sardoc binders, was a logbook, old, cloth cover, faded green. a label on the spine that read, Harlan Ridge, District Field Observations, 1974. I carried it to the desk and opened it. That was the evening that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about what I was dealing with. Before I could tell Hale about the logbook, he came in the next morning, poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking, and set one in front of me. Then he sat down and looked at the desk for a moment, and I understood that he had decided, overnight, to give me something. He told me about his first year at Harlan Ridge. It was 1997. He'd been assigned as a secondary coordinator for a missing person case. A woman named Paulette Raines, 43 years old, reported overdue by her hiking group after a day trip into the northern sectors. The search had been straightforward at first. They found her inside Sector 9 on the second day, ambulatory, presenting as disoriented but physically intact. The team lead made the call to transport immediately. Citing medical conservatism, she seemed confused. It was getting dark. The station was 47 minutes from County Medical. The transport vehicle was a district pickup, 2-seat cab. The team lead drove. Hale rode in the back cargo area with the woman they had recovered. He described what happened in that vehicle with a precision that I recognized as the precision of a memory that has been carefully compressed over a long period of time. Not because the details had faded, because the only way to carry certain memories is to make them smaller than they actually are. He said, she wasn't the same person at mile 12 as she was at mile 1. He said it like that, not describing what the change was, not describing what she did or said, or how her physical presentation altered. Just the fact of the change, stated in the flattest possible language, and the implication underneath it that mile 12 of a 47-minute drive was the point at which remaining in the cargo bed of that truck became the most frightening experience of his professional life. The team lead pulled over. They left the vehicle. They waited on the roadside. Hale didn't tell me how long they waited. He said the district coordinator at the time, a man who was now dead from causes unrelated, had driven out personally when the radio check-in was missed. He said the coordinator had taken one look at the transport vehicle's cargo area and made a call on the radio using a code Hale didn't recognize. After that, Hale said, they laminated the card. He drank his coffee. He looked at the topo map on the wall. And that was everything he was going to give me about 1997. I told him I'd found the logbook. He set his coffee down. He looked at me for a moment, with an expression that wasn't quite surprise, more like a man checking whether the thing he expected had finally arrived. Where? He said. Filing cabinet, behind the current binders. He nodded slowly. He picked his coffee back up. He said the logbook predated the current district configuration, that it had been maintained by the previous district ranger beginning in 1974, and that the district office had not decommissioned it because it contained operational observations that remained relevant. He said I was technically within my authorization to read it. Then he said he'd prefer I didn't. I asked him why. He said, it doesn't tell you anything. The rules don't already tell you. It just tells you how the rules got written. I sat with that for a moment. how the rules got written, the events that preceded each rule, the specific incidents that had produced each specific clause, the people involved in those incidents, and what had happened to them. He said it like he was trying to spare me something, and I believed that was genuine. I don't think Hale was a man who made calculated decisions out of self-interest. I think he was a man who had spent 25 years managing his own relationship with this place and had developed a specific theory about how much information helped and how much simply added weight without adding protection. I told him I'd already read part of it. He looked at me for another moment. Then he nodded once, finished his coffee, and stood up. "Then keep reading," he said, "but come to me with questions, not conclusions." He drove back down the fire road as the morning light came fully over the ridge. I sat at the operations desk with the logbook and turned to where I'd left off. Earl Canfield had been the Harlan Ridge District Ranger from 1974 to 1989, when he retired to a small town in Western Virginia, and according to the single biographical reference I later found in a district personnel archive, stopped speaking about his time at Harlan Ridge to anyone who asked. His logbook was thorough, in the way that old-school field documentation is thorough handwritten, precise, conservative in language, built on the understanding that a field log is a professional document and not a personal one. The early entries were exactly what you'd expect: wildlife observations, trail conditions, resource assessments, visitor counts, equipment maintenance. But I was reading for the anomalies. And once you know what you're looking for in a document like this, you find them. The first one was a 1976 entry. A missing day hiker, recovered in the northern sector, described as disoriented and reluctant to provide identifying information. The recovery team noted that the subject had difficulty answering questions about where she'd started her hike and who she'd come up with, but attributed this to exposure and shock. She was transported, and the case was closed. Canfield had written, in the margin beside this entry, in slightly smaller handwriting, as though added afterward, "Cold. 73 degrees ambient. Hands cold to the bone." Then 1977. A recovered hiker who spoke at length about the search team members in ways that exceeded normal observation, knew names, mentioned family details, asked inappropriate questions. The log entry described it as unusual behavior, potentially consistent with psychological distress. Canfield's marginal note, second this year. Subject asked Briggs about his daughter by name. Briggs has never spoken of her on duty. And then the 1977 year-end observation written in the log's summary section. Second recovery this year, where subject was cold to the touch in 72-degree ambient. No medical explanation given. Logging separately. The separately kept log was what I found next, tucked inside the back cover of the main logbook. A smaller notebook, unlined, filled with Canfield's handwriting in entries that were more compressed, more careful, written with the evident awareness that what he was documenting did not have an obvious place in standard operational reporting. I read it at the operations desk through the morning hours, the ridge outside gray and cold and silent, the generator humming in the back room, and felt the understanding of what this place was billed itself, slowly in my chest, like cold water rising. The 1981 entry in Canfield's supplemental log was the longest single entry in the document. It covered 3.5 pages and was written in 2 clearly different sittings. The handwriting changed midway through, became slightly larger, slightly less controlled, in the way handwriting changes when the writer is tired, or has been drinking, or is simply carrying something too heavy. It documented a missing woman. The name in the entry was Paulette Rains. I read the name twice. Hale had told me about Paulette Rains the previous morning, told me about the 1997 case, the transport, the thing that changed at mile 12. But the logbook entry for Paulette Rains was dated June 4th, 1981, 16 years before Hale's account. The same name, a different woman, or the same situation with a different person wearing it. The 1981 Paulette Rains had been reported missing by her husband after a solo nature walk in the lower Sector 9 approach area. She'd been missing for 31 hours when the search team located her, standing in a clearing on the far side of a small meadow, approximately 60 meters from the team's position, facing away from them. The team lead, a man named Aldous Breck, had called her name. The log recorded what happened next in Canfield's careful language. Subject turned and walked toward the team. Breck made physical contact, took subject's hand to assist her across the drainage ditch at the meadow's edge. Subject was cold. Breck noted it immediately. The party returned to the station. What returned to the station was not Paulette Rains. The rest of the entry I will not describe in its entirety. What I will say is that Canfield documented the next 18 hours in clinical, careful language, and that the entry ends with the following line: Rule required no verbal name confirmation in field. Write this down. Tell the next one. Breck had called her name. She had turned toward the sound of it. Whatever was in that clearing had used the sound of its own name as a navigation point, and then Breck had taken its hand and walked it out of the forest. The rule didn't exist yet in 1981. Canfield wrote it that day. He wrote it so the next person would know. I thought about the voice at the Sector 9 boundary, saying Marcus Webb. I thought about the way it had paused after each repetition, as though waiting for a response that would tell it something, as though the response was part of the mechanism. I thought about how close I had come to giving it one. Tucked inside the back cover of Canfield's supplemental log, folded into a thick square and paper-clipped to the inside of the cloth binding, were 23 documents. Sector clearance reports. I unfolded them carefully. They were various ages. The oldest on paper, so brittle it cracked at the fold lines. The most recent, printed on standard district stationery that I recognized from the current supply shelf. The most recent was dated 4 years ago. Each one was filed according to Rule 3's protocol. Subject found outside designated search corridor. Subject claims they were never lost. Name excluded from the district incident log. Sector clearance report filed in its place. 23 of them across 40 years. I started cross-referencing on my phone. The signal inside the station was weak but functional. I searched the first name a man documented in a 1975 report. Nothing. No social media, no obituary, No public record of any kind for that name in the county of origin listed on the report. Second name, same result. Third name, same. Fourth name, an obituary. I found it in a digitized county newspaper archive. The woman had died in March of 1987. A car accident, survived by a husband and 2 children. Survived by a full and documented life. The obituary was thorough and specific. The sector clearance report for her name was dated October of 1987. 7 months after she died, something carrying her name and her appearance had walked out of Sector 9 and told a search team it had never been lost. And a search team had followed Rule 3. Had filed the sector clearance report, had released it back toward the tree line, and not followed. I sat at the operations desk with 23 folded reports in front of me and thought about what Rule 3 was actually protecting against. Not the people who walked out of the forest, the world outside it. The rule existed to prevent whatever came out of Sector 9 from entering the documentary record, from establishing a name, a case number, a date of recovery, from becoming, officially, a person. I was still sitting there when my radio crackled. The grid team's voice came through, clear and careful. They'd found Marcus Webb. Base, this is Grid 2. We have a visual on the subject. I was on the radio before the transmission finished. I asked for position, condition, any apparent injuries. The team member, a volunteer named Santos, steady voice experienced, gave me the grid reference. It was approximately 200 meters outside the Sector 9 boundary, south and east of the boundary post where Hale and I had stood 2 days earlier. A legitimate search area, within the adjusted corridor. Santos said Marcus was sitting upright against a white oak, ambulatory, oriented to person. He said Marcus had responded correctly to the signal code contact protocol. He said Marcus was asking for water and appeared to be in good physical condition. Then Santos said, "He seems fine. He's just..." A pause. Brief. Very calm. For someone who's been out 2 nights. That pause, that specific qualifier. Santos was an experienced SAR volunteer. He knew what overwrought looked like, and he knew what shock looked like, and he knew what the specific combination of dehydration, sleep deprivation, and 48 hours of wilderness exposure looked like in a recovered subject. He was telling me, in the most professionally careful language available to him, that what he was looking at didn't look like any of those things. Hale was already moving toward the vehicle when I came out of the operations room. He'd been standing at the map. He'd heard the transmission on his own radio. He drove. I didn't argue. He took the fire road at a speed that suggested he had driven it often enough, in enough different conditions, that the gravel didn't give him pause. We didn't speak on the drive to the grid reference. The trees moved past the windows in the early afternoon light. The canopy was dense enough that the road ran in a partial shadow, the light coming through in pieces, broken and angled. I thought about the 23 sector clearance reports. I thought about the woman who had died in March and been found in October. I thought about what Santos had heard in Marcus Webb's voice that made a calm, experienced volunteer pause mid-sentence and choose his words carefully before finishing the transmission. Marcus Webb was sitting exactly where Santos had described him, back against a white oak, at the edge of a small clearing, pack beside him, a half-empty water bottle from Santos's kit in his hand. He looked like a man who had been in the woods for 2 days. The clothing was right. The beard growth was right. The slight weathering around the eyes from wind and cold was right. He looked up when I came through the brush into the clearing. And before Santos could introduce us, before I had said a word, he said my name. Daniel. Not Mercer. Not my surname, which was on my vest in reflective lettering. My first name, which appeared nowhere on my gear, and which I had told no one at the Harlan Ridge District. My application had been processed through the county SAR office. The only document with my first name on it that existed anywhere in this district was Hale's internal personnel file, which was in a locked drawer at the station. He said it the way you say someone's name when you already know them. Comfortably, with a small nod of recognition. Then he said, "You worked county EMS before this." I kept my face exactly where it needed to be. I said nothing. I heard Hale step into the clearing behind me, and a moment later, I felt his hand on my shoulder, a single firm grip. 2 fingers pressed close together in a way that had no innocent explanation. Rule 4. I knew Rule 4. I could recite Rule 4. Rule 4 said, any subject who references specific personal information about a team member should be escorted to the edge of the search corridor and released back toward the tree line. Marcus Webb was looking at me with Marcus Webb's eyes, in Marcus Webb's face, wearing Marcus Webb's jacket. And he had just said my first name and identified my professional background before I had spoken a single word to him. Santos was looking between us with the expression of a man who has noticed something he doesn't have the context to interpret. I said, "Let's get you some water. Can you stand?" Marcus stood easily. No stiffness, no favoring of a joint. After 2 nights in October terrain without a confirmed campsite, the human body does not stand easily. It cooperates eventually, but there is an effort to it that shows. He stood like someone who had been sitting in a chair for 20 minutes. Rule 4 says, escort to the edge of the search corridor. Release toward the tree line. Do not restrain. Do not follow. I want you to understand what following that rule actually looks like in practice, because I think the clinical language of it obscures the reality. You are standing in a clearing with a person who looks exactly like the person you've been searching for. That person has their name and their face and their clothes and their voice. And you are supposed to walk them to the edge of the woods and watch them go back into it. You are supposed to let a missing person walk back into the forest alone. There is no version of that action that doesn't look, to any reasonable observer, like a serious breach of duty. There is no version of it that doesn't feel like abandonment. I knew this. I knew it standing in that clearing. I knew why the rule existed, and I still could not immediately make my body cooperate with the instruction. I said to Marcus that we needed to confirm his recovery position for the SARDOC documentation, and would he walk with me to the corridor marker? I said it in the even, professional tone that I hoped Santos would hear as routine procedure. Marcus didn't move. He looked at me for a moment, not suspiciously, curiously, the way someone looks when they're deciding whether a social script is performing correctly. Then he said, "Is Claire coming?" He said her name with the same comfortable familiarity he'd said mine. He asked about the timeline. He asked how they'd transport him, and what the drive time to the county seat was, and whether they'd notify the search team. Reasonable questions. Exactly the questions a recovered hiker would ask. They were too exact. They were the questions someone had assembled after listening to SAR radio traffic for 2 days. They were the vocabulary of recovery without the texture of it. I said, "We need to walk the corridor boundary first." He smiled slightly and said he understood. He picked up his pack, and then he said, "It must have been hard losing that patient, the cardiac one, Gerald." I stopped. The clearing was quiet. The wind moved through the upper canopy. Santos was 6 meters to my left and completely still. Gerald, 51 years old, dead in the emergency department of a county hospital 18 months ago. I had told no one at Harlan Ridge about Gerald. I had told almost no one anywhere about Gerald. The name existed in an incident report filed with the county EMS service, and in my own memory, and nowhere else, that this man, or whatever was wearing this man, could have accessed. I looked at Hale. Hale looked back at me and said, calmly and clearly, and for the benefit of the full team, "We're going to take Marcus back to the station for medical evaluation. Santos, radio base, and let them know we're transporting." He caught my eye over Marcus's shoulder. His expression said everything the words couldn't. We were invoking Rule 1. Rule 1 says the subject must be held at the Ridge Station overnight, not transported until first light, regardless of medical stability or subject request. Marcus Webb was in the station's second bunk room by 8 o'clock that evening. We had offered him food. He ate precisely the right amount. The appetite of a man who had been in the field for 2 days and was no longer hungry. We had offered him the satellite phone to call Claire. He said he'd already spoken to her and that she was fine. We had offered him dry socks, and he had accepted them and changed without ceremony. He was polite. He was cooperative. He was the performance of a recovered hiker, so well executed that I found myself, in brief moments, doubting my own assessment. Because the alternative was something my professional mind kept trying to refuse. At 9:15, I did an EMT assessment. I told him it was standard protocol for recovered subjects, which it was, technically, so the lie was thin enough to be believed. I took his core temperature with a tympanic thermometer under the premise of checking for exposure, 93.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The clinical threshold for mild hypothermia is 95 degrees Fahrenheit. 93.8 is moderate hypothermia by the textbook I had memorized. It requires intervention, warming, monitoring, in a worst-case scenario, hospital transport. I moved the flashlight beam across his pupils. Sluggish response, both sides. The kind of pupil response that in the emergency department triggers a neuro workup and an immediate call to the attending. I asked him to breathe toward the window. The station's interior temperature at that hour was 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Human breath in 61 degrees Fahrenheit air produces visible vapor. This is biology, not magic. The thermal differential is sufficient, always, at that temperature gap. His breath produced nothing. The air between his lips and the window glass was clear. I wrote nothing in the incident log. I put the thermometer back in my kit. I told him to sleep and that we'd sort out transport in the morning. He said goodnight pleasantly and lay down on the cot. All 3 markers from Rule 7 were present. I went to the operations room and sat across from Hale and put my field notebook on the desk between us with the 3 findings written in it. He read them. He looked at the numbers for a long time. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He didn't tell me the thermometer was malfunctioning. He said, then we follow Rule 1 to first light, and we follow Rule 7 until then. At 2:47 in the morning, my radio went dead. Not battery failure, I had a fresh battery set, and the power indicator was green when I checked it. Signal loss. The VHF carrier simply dropped, mid-static hiss, to nothing. Hale's radio went at the same moment. I watched him check it when mine dropped. Watched the same confirmation cross his face. The mineral interference blackout zone had expanded. Or something had expanded it. Rule 5. If radio contact is lost for more than 12 minutes during a night search in sectors 7 through 11, return to the last marked waypoint and remain stationary for no fewer than 8 minutes. Do not call out during the stationary period. We were not in the field. We were in the station. But the last marked waypoint for a station-based team is the station interior, the operations room, the fixed position with known grid coordinates. We were already there. Hale looked at me and held up 5 fingers. Rule 5. I nodded. We had to hold position and hold silence for 8 minutes. Marcus's bunk room was across the narrow corridor from the operations room. The door was partially open, the way it had been since he'd gone to bed. I could see a sliver of the room from where I sat, the edge of the cot, the corner of the wool blanket. For the first 3 minutes of the silence window, nothing changed. At minute 4, I heard movement from the bunk room, the small sounds of a body repositioning on a cot. Normal sounds. I kept my eyes on the corridor. At minute 5, the movement stopped. At minute 6, I saw the sliver of visible bunk room change. The shape of the blanket altered. Marcus was sitting up in the cot. I could see his silhouette through the door gap, upright, motionless, facing the exterior wall of the station. The wall that faced the northern tree line. He was still, completely still. Not the stillness of a person who is woken from sleep and is reorienting. The stillness of something attending. Something that had its attention fixed on a specific point beyond the wall and was doing nothing else. 6 minutes of silence in a dark building with a radio that didn't work and something that wasn't Marcus Webb sitting upright 15 feet away, facing the forest. 2 minutes left. At minute 6 of the 8-minute window, something struck the exterior wall of the station. 3 times, evenly spaced, 1 per second, approximately. Not the irregular impact of a branch moved by wind. This was deliberate, measured, the 3-beat knock of something that understood the social convention of knocking. Hale did not move. I did not move. In the bunk room, through the door gap, Marcus's silhouette turned its head toward the exterior wall, toward the source of the knocking, the way a person turns when they hear a sound they expected. The silence stretched out, 50 seconds remaining in the window. 40. The knocking came again at minute 7. This time at the door, the station's main entrance, at the far end of the operations room. The same pattern. 3 beats, even spacing. Confident. Marcus smiled. I saw it through the door gap. The sliver of available light was enough. He was still facing the wall, and the smile was not an expression of comfort or relief. It was the specific expression of something that knew it was winning. That had calculated the board correctly, and was watching the final pieces align. 30 seconds. 20. I was watching the door, the metal core construction door, with the 2-point lock that I had set before 9 o'clock. 4 inches of material between the operations room and whatever was standing at it. I thought about Rule 4, escort to the corridor edge, release, do not follow, and understood, sitting in the dark at 3 a.m. That Rule 4 had not anticipated the scenario where the subject wouldn't cooperate with being released, or the scenario where the thing that needed releasing had already called something else to come help. 10 seconds. Hale stood. He crossed the operations room in 4 steps and put his hand flat against the door, not opening it, holding it. He said quietly, in a voice just above a whisper, "It'll stop." 8 minutes elapsed. The radio crackled. The knock did not come again. In the bunk room, the smile faded. The silhouette lay back down on the cot. The station was quiet in the specific way of a place that has passed through something and come out the other side slightly changed. I looked at the strip of masking tape above my bunk, visible through the operations room door. Trust the 8 minutes. I understood now why those words had been pressed hard enough to bleed through the tape. First light reaches the eastern face of the Harlan Ridge Station at approximately 6:12 in the morning in early October. I know the exact time because I was sitting at the operations desk watching the window above the exterior door. And I was watching it the way you watch a thing that you have staked a significant portion of your remaining stability on. At 6:12, the sky went from the flat black of pre-dawn to a deep blue-gray, and the window above the door began to register color. At 6:18, the first direct light hit the exterior wall. From the bunk room, I heard movement, the sounds of someone waking normal sounds, human sounds, with the specific, groggy, uncertain quality of a person who has slept poorly and is reorienting to where they are and why. Marcus Webb appeared in the corridor doorway. He looked at me, and the thing that I can only describe as presence, the quality of focused, calculating attention that had been behind his eyes since Santos's clearing was diminished. Not gone, receded. He said, "Where are we?" He said it with genuine uncertainty. The question of a person who had lost track of time, not a question assembled from observed behavior. He asked what day it was. He asked how long he'd been here. He asked, with a crack in his voice that was the first real thing I had heard from him since the clearing. "Is Claire coming?" He asked it differently than he had the night before. The night before, it had been informational. This was need. I checked his temperature, 96.4. I moved the light across his pupils. They contracted appropriately, both sides, with the normal speed of a person responding to photostimulation. I asked him to breathe toward the window. The vapor was visible, All 3 markers from Rule 7 had reversed. Hale was watching from the doorway. I looked at him and gave him the 3 data points with my eyes. He nodded once. At 6:40 a.m., we put Marcus Webb in the transport vehicle and drove him down the fire road, away from the ridge, toward the county seat and its hospital and its fluorescent corridors and its mundane, desperately ordinary light. 3 days after Marcus Webb was discharged from the county hospital, dehydration, mild exposure, no other clinical findings. Hale drove out to my station and sat down across from me and gave me the only explanation he had. He prefaced it by saying it wasn't an explanation. He said that was important to understand first. He didn't know what was in Sector 9. He didn't know what lived in the mine shafts beneath it, or where it had come from, or how long it had been there. He knew the rules, and he knew that the rules worked, and that was the perimeter of his operational knowledge, and he had made his peace with working inside that perimeter a long time ago. He told me that over the 50 years of documented operational history in the Harlan Ridge District, there had been 61 confirmed Sector 9 recovery events. He said, confirmed with the particular weight of a man who understood there were likely others that hadn't been confirmed because the teams hadn't survived to document them. Of the 61, 43 had followed the rules. All 43 had outcomes consistent with Marcus Webb's ambiguous, frightening, unresolved, but survivable. Subjects transported at first light showed reversed clinical markers. Teams who held the silence during radio blackout found that the exterior threat did not breach. The rules, applied correctly, produced survivable outcomes. 18 had not followed the rules. He didn't describe those 18. He said only that they accounted for the reason the rules existed in the written form they did, and that 4 of the 18 were documented in a separate file in the district office that required regional SAR authority clearance to access, and that he had read 2 of those files once, in 1999, and had not read them again. Then he said, "The sentence I have thought about more than anything else," he said during my time at Harlan Ridge. "The rules don't tell you what it is. They just tell you how to make it let go. Not defeat it, not kill it, not understand it. How to make it let go." I have thought about those words for 11 months. I asked him about the photographs, the figures at the corridor edges, always appearing in images taken during active searches, always deleted per Rule 6, always reported to the district coordinator. I asked him what he'd seen in those reports over the years, and whether there was a pattern. He said yes, there was a pattern. He pulled a folded topo map from his jacket pocket. He'd brought it deliberately, which told me he'd been planning this conversation for longer than this morning, and spread it on the desk. Harlan Ridge District, Northern Sectors. Sector 9 marked in its standard pencil boundary. He took a pen and made 4 small marks inside the sector boundary. 4 points, roughly equidistant, forming a rough rectangle on the topo surface. He said, "Every photograph containing an unlogged figure, every single one across 22 years of reports. The figures are always standing within 10 meters of one of these 4 coordinates. The 4 coordinates corresponded to nothing visible on the topo surface. No trail junctions, no geographic features, No infrastructure markers. He flipped the map over and showed me a copy of a 1968 survey document. Mining infrastructure diagram. 4 sealed shaft access points, marked in the survey with decommission dates of 1969, following the disappearance of 3 miners during an underground assessment. The shafts had been sealed and never reopened. The federal wilderness designation that had come in 1971 had added a layer of administrative protection that effectively prevented any future excavation or assessment. Hale said the district had a standing coordination agreement with the Federal Wilderness Office. The shafts were not to be mapped, excavated, or referenced in public documentation. The laminated card was the only official acknowledgement that the shafts existed as an operational concern. I asked how far down they went. Hale folded the map. He said, "No one has answered that question since 1969. And the people who went down in 1969 to answer it didn't come back up." He put the map back in his jacket. He looked at the topo on the wall for a moment. Then he told me I had done good work on the Marcus Webb search. He said it like a man closing a file. Like the conversation was over and the case was over, and we would go back to the normal operational rhythm of the district, and that would be that. I resigned 2 weeks later. I live in a city now. 3rd-floor apartment, 1 bedroom, a window that faces east and gets good morning light. The building has a secure entrance with a coded lock, and I know all 3 of my neighbors by name, and I know which of them keeps irregular hours, and which of them have dogs that bark at the elevator, and which of them I can hear through the wall if the building is quiet enough. I know all of this deliberately. I built this knowledge deliberately, the way you build a structure that you intend to rely on. I don't hike. I don't camp. I renewed my EMT certification last spring, and I'm working 2 shifts a month at a county urgent care clinic, which is slow work, simple work, the kind of emergencies that have clean edges and known protocols. It's good. I sleep most nights. I cook real food. I run in the mornings on a paved trail along a river where the highest ground within visible range is the pedestrian bridge. I think about Claire sometimes. I have found her name in connection with Marcus Webb in exactly 2 places since leaving Harlan Ridge. A social media post from 8 months ago, showing a hike they apparently took together in the Smokies, smiling, gear appropriate, looking like 2 people for whom the Appalachian wilderness is still a place you go voluntarily. And a brief tag in a local news piece about a trail conservation fundraiser they both attended. He looks like Marcus. He presumably is Marcus. I have no clinical or evidentiary basis for any other conclusion. I have also never called to check. The flashlights went in the truck bed on the day I left the station. I haven't replaced them. 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning, I went down to check my mail slot before my remote shift started. The envelope was standard letter size. No return address. Postmarked from Harlan County, Kentucky. My name was typed on the front, first and last, and the address was correct in every detail. My current address, which I did not use during my time at the district, and which I have not published anywhere. I stood at the mailbox bank in my building's lobby and held it for a moment. Then I took it upstairs. Inside was a laminated card. Not the same card. I knew the card from the station. 7 rules, specific formatting, the particular institutional font of an early 80s document printed on equipment that no longer exists. This card was newer. The font was the same. The formatting was the same. But there were 9 rules. 2 of them were new. The first new rule, Rule 8, read: if a previous district volunteer makes contact after resignation, do not confirm their identity verbally. Use only signal codes. A volunteer who asks you to confirm their name aloud should be guided, not answered. I read that 3 times. Do not confirm their identity verbally. A volunteer who asks you to confirm their name. The rule was written about former volunteers, about people who had left the district, people like me. It specified the same protocol as Rule 2. No verbal name confirmation, guide rather than answer, but applied to the people who had once worked the ridge and were now somewhere else. I don't know what that rule means exactly. I have several theories, and none of them are comfortable. The second new rule, Rule 9, was printed in standard font for the first 6 words, and then blacked out. Fully redacted. A solid bar of black ink over everything that came after in the event that a previous. In the event that a previous. A previous what? A previous volunteer. A previous subject. A previous incident. A previous something. The sentence ends in black ink, and I have no way to finish it. I tried to reach Hale. His district extension was disconnected. The county SAR office told me he retired effective 3 months ago and left no forwarding contact. Nobody I reached at the district had spoken to him since his last day. So, here's where I am now. 11 months out from Harlan Ridge. Desk job, small apartment, east-facing window. A life I built carefully around the edges of something I can't explain. And a laminated card with 9 rules sitting on my kitchen counter because I haven't decided what to do with it yet. And because putting it in a drawer feels like the wrong kind of not thinking about it. I check my breath every morning. That's the thing I haven't told anyone. Before I get out of bed, before coffee, before I look at my phone, before I do anything that belongs to the normal operating system of a functioning adult. I breathe toward the window. I watch the vapor form in the cold apartment air. In eastern Kentucky, in October, the ambient temperature makes the check easy. Here, in a climate-controlled apartment building, it's less reliable. Some mornings, the apartment is warm enough that the differential is too small to produce vapor clearly. On those mornings, I open the window and let the outside air in and do it again. I do not start my day until I have completed the check. I don't know exactly what I'm checking for. I know what Rule 7 says. I know what 3 specific clinical signs in a recovered subject mean, according to 50 years of Harlan Ridge operational documentation. I know that those signs reversed in Marcus Webb at first light, which is consistent with whatever hold the thing had on him, releasing when the conditions changed. What I don't know is whether the hold can transfer, whether whatever made contact with a team member constitutes its own form of exposure, whether there is a version of this that doesn't resolve cleanly at sunrise. Every morning, the vapor appears. Every morning, I note it and release the breath I've been holding and get up and make coffee and go about my day. But here's what I want you to understand, and this is the part I've been building toward since I started talking, the part I needed to say out loud to someone, even if that someone is every person listening to this at once. The card came to my home address, an address I never used at Harlan Ridge. The new rules were written in the same format as the old ones, which means whoever wrote them has access to the district's documentation standards and the district's institutional knowledge. And Rule 8 was written about people like me, about former volunteers, about what to do if one of us makes contact after leaving, which means someone, somewhere, has been paying attention to where the former volunteers went. The morning I stop seeing vapor, I'll call someone. I just don't know anymore who to call, or whether the person I'd be calling would know which signal code to use before they answered. I still check. Every morning. So far, it's fine.